Which church did we look at last week? Anybody remember the name? Ephesus. Very good. So I have my nice map of the 7 churches in Revelation, which would be modern-day Turkey, across the Aegean Sea from the boot. Can't really see it good on here. So there's Patmos again, which is where John is imprisoned for the faith, he says. And remember that the order in which the churches are listed form a nice circle for us, a progression where they pass this letter around for mutual encouragement week after week. And so zooming in, we looked at Ephesus, which is the first port stop from Patmos. And then another port city just north of there is Smyrna. So you can see that Smyrna is also right in that little bay. Smyrna is also a large city like Ephesus. It's also a port city. So you guys know history well enough to know that if you're situated on a lake or a river, you usually can do pretty well. So that rings true for both Ephesus and Smyrna. Again, we've got temples to Greek gods, this time Zeus and Aphrodite. We've got a large Jewish population in Smyrna. Polycarp is the bishop there later in history. Anybody heard the name Polycarp? A couple of you. We talked about Ignatius a little bit last week, Polycarp this week. These are early church fathers of whom we have a lot of their writings survived, so we can kind of attest to the early history of the church. Beasley Murray, who I quoted this morning as well in the sermon, says, "It so happens that one of the best-known Christians in the early church was probably sitting in the congregation when this letter was read. This was Polycarp, who later became Smyrna's bishop and was martyred about 160 AD. I find this really fascinating, not because Polycarp is some mystical figure, although he was treated as such because of the events surrounding his martyrdom. Some people saw him sparkle and stuff like this. As far as martyrs went, there was a lot of fantastical stories. It may or may not have been the case with Polycarp's martyrdom. But it's interesting to think about apostolic succession. Now, there are people today who say, use that term to say they have the authority of the New Testament apostles. That's not the way I'm using the term. In church history, we talk about apostolic succession to say the teachings of the apostles were passed down accurately. And so we know students of the apostles, and we know the students' students, and sometimes we know the student's student's student, right? And we sort of get our way into a really full understanding of the Scripture based on the way they understood the apostles. And so there's something from the 2nd century already called the Rules of Faith that reads like a creed. I've been going over this in my church history class. So you're going to get a lot of that stuff dumped on you for a while. But the Rules of Faith is basically a long form of the Apostles' Creed. So already in the 2nd century, they have doctrine worked out. So last week we met Ignatius. Ignatius is from down in Alexandria, probably a student of Mark, the guy who wrote the gospel. Mark was a student of Peter, the apostle. And Ignatius writes a letter to Timothy at the church in Ephesus. And Timothy's a student of Paul, and here we have Polycarp receiving this encouragement from the Apostle John, and so on and so forth. So the whole history of the New Testament is immediately picked up and attested to. There is no time for myth, doctrinal manipulation, or telephone game style oral history. We have this written down and attested to from the very beginning, and Revelation just gives us a couple of touch points in that regard. So we're going to read the address to the church in Smyrna, which is Revelation 2, 8 through 11. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, "These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid about what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. So, first, a little bit of grounding, place and time. Why do we mention Domitian, Rome, the early church? I've been throwing some dates at you in the services, and I'm not a big dates guy, but why is that important? Well, like Old Testament prophecy, there is an immediate place and time that matters and that informs our understanding of the book of Revelation. These hearers in Ephesus and Smyrna, who we've already met, and the others, are being persecuted, even to the point of death. So when it says they are about to suffer, when they are about to be put in prison, when it says that they'll suffer persecution even to the point of death, we know that this is real experiences for the Christians in the church in Smyrna. It's not figurative stuff here. This is just a real address like an epistle. It says, you in your place and time are experiencing this type of trial and suffering and persecution to the point of death. And it acknowledges it right here. And we have it in other historical stuff. This is what's happening. The book of Revelation is dead on, accurate place and time. So, when we interpret the visions of Revelation, we've got to be grounded by these real place and time, people and setting. We did that this morning. What does the initial hearer hear when you say a conqueror bent on conquest? Well, they might think of Rome rapidly expanding, even in their time, 95 AD. What do they hear when you say men will slay each other? Perhaps they think of the gladiator games. And we have that very accurate one about the famine where you say, oh yeah, I know about the high cost of barley when there's enough wine to go around for the rich, right? So this stuff really matters to ground us in place and time. And it also helps us then to apply it to us today, because they're not just fantastical things that we can ascribe whatever meaning seems to hold together. They're really grounded in something. And so when we read the six seals, we can say, I see how that would have mattered to daily life for them. How do trials and temptations matter to us today? And how might we be encouraged the same way? So it's important to keep getting this kind of place and time stuff. Well, there's a couple interesting things in the address to the church in Smyrna. First, they're one of two churches of the seven that don't get any rebuke. Remember last week the church in Ephesus had forgotten their first love. Smyrna? Hey, doing great. Philadelphia also, doing great. Not that Philadelphia. They're not probably doing so great. There's a large Jewish population, and so we consider Jews and Christians, and they're both being persecuted by Rome. What does it mean when we read the word synagogue of Satan? Those who proclaim to be Jews but are a synagogue of Satan. Well, Jews to the Romans are indistinguishable from Christians. Romans considered both Jews and Christians to be atheists. Why, do you think? Partly. What other religious thing is going on in Rome? Caesar gets worshipped, but who else? They've got so many gods, and the Christians and the Jews both reject all of them. And to the Romans, one God might as well be zero. Like, you're rejecting this entire pantheon of gods. You're not worshiping any of them. You might as well be an atheist. How could you not even find your God among this list, even if you call it by a different name? Wouldn't your God be part of the pantheon? And the Jews and the Christians both said no. We don't worship any of those gods. So they considered them to be atheists. They considered them to be cannibals. Why might that be? Yeah, so they heard stories about the Christians gathering to eat the body and the blood and drink the blood of their Savior. So they think these people are strange. And they also think that they're anti-Rome, and that's a little bit more general because they didn't participate in anything the Romans did. And so they think there's kind of this insurrection among these atheist Christians and Jews. Well, the Jews kind of found a way out of this. And so if any of you are familiar with Josephus, who wrote a contemporary of this time, who wrote a long-form history of the Jews, Josephus was actually trapped in a cave with a bunch of people, and eventually captured by the Romans, and ended up winning the favor of the Romans, of the Caesar, because Josephus would tattle, basically. And so one way that the Jews found relief from the persecution was to inform on Christians. Josephus had talked about it already. And so in that way, they're sort of turned state witness and represent a synagogue of Satan. They're increasing the persecution on the Christians. So Jews are turned informants on Christians, and as a synagogue of Satan are sort of participating with what we've propped up to be the evil one, Rome. We'll call it Babylon later in Revelation. And the Jews are participating with this evil. So their synagogues are godless. They are representing a synagogue of Satan. They've turned against the Christians. It says they'll be thrown in prison for 10 days. This gets more literal readers of Revelation real excited. So does something happen during the tribulation for 10 days? If you know a little bit about Greek culture, which I don't, but commentaries I read do, they say that term used for 10 days is just an expression for short time. I'll be there in a couple minutes. We don't mean we'll be there in 2 minutes, but it's an expression used for a short time. So we remember that these are real people really being put in prison, really being persecuted unto death, and some of them will be for a short time soon. Along with Philadelphia, they're one of 2 churches who receive no rebuke. They are promised an escape of the second death. That's also an interesting thing here. So we can see Revelation 20, verse 6. Now, I hesitate to even show you this yet because we're going to kind of get ahead of ourselves the way we're working through the rest of the book, but I'm going to. So if we have questions, we'll deal with them as succinctly as we can, but this is way ahead. We will get to some of the questions you have here. Revelation 20, verse 6 says, "Blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him 1,000 years." Now let me tell you what I think and other amillennials think this means. The first death is the mortal death that we all experience on this earth. Now there's a first resurrection that those who die in the Lord receive. They get resurrected in heaven. There's a second death for those who die not in the Lord, and might as well call it Judgment Day. So those who die not in the Lord will receive a second additional punishment when Hades is thrown into hell. Now, I know we're going to get some questions on this, so just file it away. These people will not have part in that second death. So they may be persecuted unto the point of the first death, the death that we all receive in our mortal bodies, but they will not be in Hades or in hell. They will be with the Lord forever. So people who die in the Lord only die once, and then we take part in the resurrection. No second death for us.